Now, yesterday, Camilla, you said that the Supreme Court ruling on trans ideology was as important as votes for women.
And yet we've still not heard a dicky bird from the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, about that monumental day. Why not? Is it perhaps because he does think that some women can have a penis?
Camilla, should we just go through Keir Starmer's X feed, on which he tweets regularly about the things that he thinks are most important day by day? So yesterday, the day of the Supreme Court ruling on biological sex and women, he talked about Easter weekend traffic jams. That was his tweet yesterday. And then today, he tweeted on waiting lists being down, supposedly, and appointments supposedly up. Nothing, though, whatsoever on this ruling, which has created such a huge amount of debate. But the important thing is so many public bodies and, frankly, equality guidance used by private businesses has been proved to be unlawful under the terms of the Equality Act.
You'd imagine that a lot of HR departments right now are tearing up what they had previously advised employees to abide by and are actually now having to abide by the law of the land set by the Supreme Court. That's the highest court in the UK, an unappealable decision. And to be honest, and we're going to be discussing this with Trevor Phillips shortly, the law was always the law. It was just being willfully misinterpreted by trans activists in a bid to kind of silence opponents to any notion that trans women should have equal rights or indeed supreme rights to women themselves. On Starmer, to be fair, he's on holiday. We believe he's on holiday, it's Easter, whatever. He's still posted on X about different policy matters. And let's be honest, Kamal, I mean, Starmer, Lammy, Creasy, countless Labour ministers, as they are now, even in opposition as they were then, haven't covered themselves with glory. I mean, it was only 5 minutes ago, we discussed this with Helen Joyce, that the Prime Minister couldn't say whether or not a woman has a penis and suggested that 99.9% of women don't have a penis, therefore suggesting that perhaps some do. Really confused. I mean, a lot of people on the Labour side and the left, I'm sorry, have fueled a lot of the aggression against women who have been gender critical. That's the truth of the matter. So maybe, silence tells us a great deal. Is he still confused? I'm not confused. I never was confused.
I think he is, because I think the whole of the Labour Party has had such difficulty with this that they cannot work out a clear line. So instead of Keir Starmer being on the airwaves this morning to set out what the government was going to do around public bodies and businesses and their equality policies, it was actually a junior minister, health minister called Karen Smith. She was actually on to talk about a rather footling policy change on GPs and GPs appointments, which is what Keir Starmer supposedly tweeted about today, not on the Supreme Court. And she got in again it got into a mess about, can trans women use women's toilets? And although she said women's toilets are for women, which is what the law says, she couldn't then explain, well, would trans women then have to use the male toilets? So she didn't know really what the law was saying. And it was actually down to the one person who has gone out and has put forward what the law has always said, but now been made very clear by the Supreme Court, is Baroness Faulkner. She is the present chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which Trevor Phillips was previously. And she's made it very clear that single-sex services like changing rooms, like toilets, must be based on biological sex. So you've got this situation where nearly 24 hours, well, 24 hours when Karen Smith went out to talk about it, after the Supreme Court judgment, the Labour government is still not absolutely crystal clear on what this means. And Baroness Faulkner raised the issue of the NHS, where some of the most egregious errors in this area have been taking place. You spoke about the Darlington nurses yesterday, who have been so upset by the fact that an individual named Rose, who is actually a trans woman, is order or is demanding that he is able to use female changing rooms. The NHS has still got a policy back from 2019 which says that trans people, open quotes, should be accommodated according to their presentation. And Baroness Faulkner said today on the Today programme, an interview with Nick Robinson, that the Equality and Human Rights Commission had been demanding how they were going to update their guidance on this issue and still had not had a response.
We've been speaking to the health service for actually an inordinately long time, and they keep telling us they're going to produce new guidance. I think we will now be asking them when they expect to produce that new guidance. They now have clarity. There is no confusion as of yesterday at 10:30 in the morning. They can start to implement the new legal reasoning and produce their exceptions forthwith.
But they have to change it, do they? Because they have a document, the NHS guidance, that says trans people should be accommodated according to the way they dress, their name, their pronouns. That is no longer the case. That has to change.
Yes, that's correct.
And the other thing to remember about Baroness Faulkner is she was also the victim of a cancellation campaign. People tried to take her out of that post, said she was transphobic, a bigot, probably a Nazi. I mean, all of these kind of bingo words are used against people who are gender critical these days. Also, isn't it interesting this morning to see a degree of revisionism by some people who absolutely did not stand up for women? And by the way, I personally do include the Prime Minister in that. I think it's been shameful. Keir Starmer's attitude towards this entire debate has not been at all helpful and has only served to actually make life more difficult for the women campaigning on this issue, many of whom we spoke to yesterday on the podcast. So let's give an example. Bridget Phillipson, who's the Education Secretary, but she's also the Minister for Women and Equalities. She released a statement on social media saying, quote, "We have always supported the protection of single-sex spaces based on biological sex. This ruling brings clarity and confidence. Single-sex spaces are protected in law and will always be protected by this government." But then, as has been pointed out, and as the Telegraph had previously reported, the headline on that report of what Bridget Phillipson had previously said is as follows: "Trans women with penises can use female toilets, says Shadow Education Secretary." So that's a story from last year. Do these people think we're stupid? Do they think that we're not going to look up the receipts of some of this stuff? I find it extraordinary. Got a lot of people today, lots of left-wing commentators suggesting that those who are supporting the notion that a man is a man and a woman is a woman should be shamed because they agree with Donald Trump, and Donald Trump once bragged about grabbing women by the pussy. This is the descent we have entered when it comes to people perfectly rationally responding to a Supreme Court judgment. Oh, apparently they're all Trump supporters. What, Julie Bindel? What has happened to the world, Kamal? Honestly, it's depressing. Oh, and the other one, the Scottish Labour leader, Anas Sarwar. Now, this is a brilliant example of revisionism. "I've always called for the protection of single-sex spaces on the basis of biological sex." Funny that, because other people on X point out that he actually whipped his MSPs to vote for the SNP's controversial gender bill, which says precisely the opposite of what he is now saying. Again, all these people, we've done quite a lot of stories on the Telegraph. It's worth looking at. Where are the Harry Potter actors now? How are they feeling? Emma Watson, Rupert Grint, Daniel Radcliffe, all disowned J.K. Rowling over this. David Tennant, we mentioned yesterday. All these people, honestly.
And as we will hear from Trevor Phillips in a couple of minutes, it is not difficult. So the British Transport Police have come out today saying they're revising all their rules around who can search suspects or people, using the transport system across the UK. So the NHS should have come out today and said, we are revising all of our policies. Any business that has the Stonewall stamp of approval should be coming out today saying they are revising their policies immediately.
I mean, Stonewall can issue an apology to all women everywhere, can't they?
But they should be doing this immediately. I find it difficult that, given that we have known, Camilla, that this case was coming, a week ago, the media are told, everyone knew this was happening. The government should have had a prepared statement ready to go beyond a spokesman said, which is what they did through the lobby system yesterday. The public need to be able to hear what the government that they have voted for is going to do to ensure that all the public bodies, particularly the public bodies, because those are the ones that we pay for and provide absolutely essential services, the police, the NHS, education, it should all be laid out, because that is what government is for. And if you're thinking to yourself, why is voters' trust so dipped in government? It's because, A, as you say, they can see hypocrisy when it's staring them in the face, and also they can also hear when nothing is being said. They also can feel what that means.
Yes.
It's because they are uncomfortable with what has happened. But they can't be straightforward about that. I would rather they came out and almost made the wrong argument, the no argument. Okay, Keir Starmer, if you do believe that 0.1% of women can have a penis, keep having the debate, keep
Give us
saying
the
it.
argument.
Let's let the voters decide. But silence is worse, because all those organizations that are not aligning with the law, every day that now passes that we are waiting for them to change is a day when women's rights are not being respected.
Yeah, it's just cowardice, frankly. But coming up, shall we speak to the man who helped to draft the Equality Act in 2010? Sir Trevor Phillips, the former chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, joins us next.
Sir Trevor Phillips joins us on the Daily Tea. Thanks so much, Sir Trevor, for coming on to the podcast. Former chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, now writer, academic and presenter of Sunday Morning on Sky News. Now, Sir Trevor, before we get into your reaction to the Supreme Court ruling yesterday, just tell us a bit about your history with this issue, because you were chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, as I say, between 2007 and 2012. The Equality Act was passed in 2010. And I believe I'm right in saying that you were very much one of the leading figures in the drafting of it.
Yes, I suppose that's probably true. But by the way, I don't know where this Sir Trevor comes from. I thought we were friends.
We are, but this is a professional interview. But okay, I'll call you Trevor from now on.
Trevor's fine. I only use the title when accompanied with by a damsel in distress. Look, yes, we started with essentially redrafting anti-discrimination legislation around about 2005, 2006, when it became clear, as we were setting up the Equality and Human Rights Commission, that a number of things were true. One is that the legislation needed a refresh. There were things on race and sex that had not been envisaged when that legislation came into being in the 1970s. But secondly, it was clear that there were a number of grounds which had not been envisaged as grounds for discrimination, where groups of people needed protection that were not in law: basis of religion, the basis of, in this case, gender reassignment, and indeed sexual orientation wasn't quite up to date. So that's why we started to think about redrafting the anti-discrimination legislation into what became the 2010 Act. And this particular issue that we've been discussing over the last day or so was really a rather important and tricky bit of it, but it became very clear to those of us who were, as it were, holding the pen, and I think I would say there are half a dozen of us who were very, very involved in this. Harriet Harman, who was the minister, Aisha Hazarika, who was her SPAD civil servant, myself, and John Wadham, who was the chief legal counsel at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I would say were the group that really held the pen on that drafting of that act.
And given that, what's your response to yesterday's Supreme Court ruling saying that trans women are not in law women?
Well, first of all, what you've just said is correct with small caveat, not in law in certain relevant circumstances. The important thing about this is very straightforward. And I just want to make a couple of points about it. First of all, what Supreme Court has done is not change the law. All the Supreme Court has done is tell everybody what the law as intended was. It was never in anybody's mind in 2008 and 2009, when this legislation went through, that sex meant anything other than biological sex. Otherwise, we would not have put in provisions in relation to gender assignment, we would not have put in a specific protection for people who had gone through gender reassignment had we not clearly made a distinction between gender and biological sex. I think the real issue here has been not that the law was wrong or that it has really had to be clarified or has been changed. The real question I think that everybody's got to ask themselves is, how is it that over the last 10 to 15 years, authorities, including government and government ministers, have been gaslit into pretending that the law is something that it is not? The point is that what the Supreme Court did yesterday was just tell us what it is, and now everybody's got to unwind the things that they did, where essentially they created procedures and policies which responded to the law as some people wanted it to be rather than what it was.
Trevor, can we talk about that gaslighting? Because you and I spend our Sunday mornings interviewing ministers and shadow ministers, and goodness me, you'll have experienced as I have them get tying themselves in knots over this issue. You know, we've had the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, suggest that 99.9% of women don't have a penis. We had David Lammy suggesting that a man could grow a cervix. I interviewed Stella Creasy. She said to me in a Telegraph interview, J.K. Rowling is wrong. A woman can have a penis. How did it come to pass that so many highly intelligent and qualified people got into such a muddle about basic biological facts?
Everybody wants to be seen as nice and compassionate. They want to be on the side of people that they think are vulnerable and under some kind of pressure, and that's reasonable. The point about this is none of that has anything to do with what is in the law. What I think happened was a lot of people decided that the way to demonstrate that they care about trans women and trans men is to pretend that the law said something that it does not. I mean, we can get all technical about it, but the essential point about the Equality Act is that it sets out categories of people or characteristics, beg your pardon, which are illegal to use when you're making judgments about who you employ, who you allow services to have, and so on. It doesn't say anything at all about kindness or niceness or anything like that. It simply says that if you treat people differently on certain grounds, that is unlawful. Now, that's got all mixed up with feeling compassionate or caring for groups of people, and the two things are completely different. So what we're now back to, I hope, is a very simple and straightforward thing in which we say you may not treat people who have had gender reassignment unequally, but that does not mean that people who have had gender reassignment become a different thing, a different species, or a different part of humanity.
You've talked, Trevor, in the past about the effects on trans people of this row. I just wondered if this is also a very good day for trans people. I mean, Camilla and I were down at the Supreme Court yesterday. We met two trans people who were very upset and thought this was an appalling day for trans people, even though the judgment has made it clear, and Camilla, you made it clear in our discussions yesterday, that this is nothing about discrimination against trans people. I mean, have these people, in trying to be kind, as you put it, although I do actually want to talk about that as well, but in trying to be kind, they have actually also affected incredibly negatively the trans people they were supposed to be helping?
The trans activists, slightly different, a rather different group of people, much smaller from trans people in general, wanted something different. The law already protects most people who have gone through gender reassignment from discrimination. And to my knowledge, most people who have gone through that basically just want to get on with their lives in their new in their new situation. And by and large, the truth of the matter is they can. By and large, most people who I know are trans aren't sort of immediately obvious as trans people, and aren't necessarily essentially spending their lives looking around in fear. What actually I think has taken place, though there are examples of that, obviously, and I'm not going to pretend that nothing negative ever happens to trans people, but I think most trans people just want to, and in today's Britain, can get on with their lives. However, there is a group of people who basically have an ideological view, which is that actually sex is not a real thing, and that they want everybody to acknowledge and accept that. And that, as a consequence, means that there should be no special facilities according to sex. There should be no different treatment according to biological sex, because in their view, biological sex is an invention. It's not really a thing. Now, the truth of the matter is, you've got to make a decision one way or the other, whether you believe this or not. The 2010 Act was pretty clear when we drafted it, when it went through Parliament, that we do believe that. What has happened since then is that this thing has grabbed hold of, if you like, the political and media classes who treat this idea that there is no such thing as a serious one. And that has meant that people have not actually followed the law. And my view, in answer to your question, Kamal, is that that has always been to the disadvantage of the average person who has gone through gender reassignment and then just wants to get on with their life in their new gender.
I know that people who supported the sort of trans extremists may have been doing it with the best of intentions, Trevor. But at the same time, that kind of, well, they're doing it out of kindness and compassion. There was nothing kind or compassionate about the way that some people, myself included, who were gender critical, were treated during this debate. We have a situation where an academic like Professor Kathleen Stock is hounded out of the University of Sussex by people wearing balaclavas. We had various quite high-profile figures, including Father Ted creator Graham Linehan, cancelled for his belief. We've had all of this vitriol against people like J.K. Rowling and other feminists, Julie Bindel, Helen Joyce, Maya Forstater. All of them have spoken about how horrific it was for them to be basically described as Nazis, merely really for calling for women's equality and also the better safeguarding of young people. So I take your point on sort of it. Some people did it with the best of intentions. Other people really didn't.
I completely agree. And there were clearly people here who basically wanted to bully everybody else. I mean, let's call it for what it is. It's just straightforward bullying. It is, if you don't accept the world as I want it to be, then you're a bigot, you're transphobic, all of that. What I'd say is two things about this. First of all, that is a very small but very noisy group. And I think, though I blame them, what I blame more are the supposed grown-ups in the room who sat there cowering as they were being shouted at and bullied by these activists. And for example, the case of Kathleen Stock, what were the university authorities thinking when they allowed that to happen? I don't blame, I sort of do blame the students, but actually I blame the authorities more, because that's the point of being an authority. You're supposed to be there to set standards, to create common sense. The other thing I'd want to say about this is just a word about my successor at the Equality and Human Rights Commission, Kishore Faulkner, who I think has played a blinder through this,
Yes.
has been unbelievably courageous. She has gone through the most awful abuse and pressure, both out from outside and, I should say, inside the organization. And she has stood up. And one doesn't want to talk about triumphs and victories and all the rest of it, but I would say that yesterday was a vindication of her courage to say that actually this is the law. It is what it is, not what you activist groups want it to be. And for saying that, which is her job, she was described as all sorts of horrible things. So I would say, if there's somebody along with For Women Scotland, who's come out of this with great credit. It is Kishwa Faulkner. I mean, the victory here is the victory for the rule of law, actually, not any individual.
Baroness Faulkner said on the Today programme this morning that the Equality and Human Rights Commission was still waiting for the NHS to give them updated guidance on this issue, despite the Commission requesting from them this guidance. What should organisations like the NHS be doing now? They are still stuck in situations where women are having to make complaints about trans women being able to access women-only services. How has the NHS got itself into such a mess, and what should they do now?
Well, what they should first of all do is stop whining about how difficult it is. It isn't difficult at all. It's very, very straightforward. They have to provide facilities for people of different sexes, and those facilities have to be protected for people of different sexes according to biology. If they want to and need to provide facilities for people who have undergone gender reassignment, then they need to do that as well. But what they must do is stop going on and on and on about how difficult it is for them to balance rights. This is not a case of balancing rights. There are no special rights. By the way, one of the things that has been really infuriating to me, to be honest, is this language of trans rights. There are no special rights associated with being trans any more than there are associated with being a man. Everybody has the right to remedies against discrimination based on the 9 characteristics in the law. But there's nothing about being trans or being a man that gives you some special rights to be anywhere. So we need to stop using that language. And the health service, which has got itself into this tangle because essentially its chiefs do not want to be seen to be quote unquote unkind or less than compassionate. They've basically put off trying to make a decision because what they want to do is to find a solution in which they're not shouted at by activists. Frankly, they just need to get a grip and say to people, this is how it's going to be. We will make sure that everybody has access according to their needs. But that does not mean that we have to pretend that, for example, a trans person is a woman or a man in order to give them the rights. The whole point of the Act, the whole thrust of it was to give trans people the rights as trans people. Someone who has had gender reassignment does not have to pretend to be a woman to gain equality. They should actually have every right, everything, every equality available to them as a trans person. They should not have to pretend to be something they are not in order to gain access to health service facilities.
And Trevor, what now for the sports arena? Because this is a tricky one now, isn't it? I mean, we've got some bodies who say that trans women aren't women for the purposes of sport and don't let them compete. We had this quite bizarre scene, didn't we, in recent weeks of 2 trans women winning a females pool competition. We've had trans women winning darts competitions. So what now for sports?
Well, I think that the principle of the way these things will work isn't going to be that complicated. I think we just have to bear in mind that when it comes to certain sports, this isn't just an abstract issue. This is a matter of women's safety and security, and what we've seen in the boxing ring. I cannot understand how anybody could imagine the battering of women in the way that we saw last year is tolerable or acceptable or in any way in line with anybody's vision of equality. I've never been able to understand why anybody defends that. My own view about this is that what will probably happen is that we will, in everyday facilities, there will end up being male facilities, female facilities, and what I would call don't care facilities, or what people might call unisex facilities. And that will be, I suspect that will become normal. In sport, I think that there will be probably two categories. There will be a women's category, which is for biological women only, and there will be an open category, in which anybody can play. And I suspect that's probably going to be the sensible, common sense way in which we resolve all of the difficulties on this.
Can you tell me, Trevor, we've spoken a little bit about how were so many institutions seized by this issue of activism around trans rights. Stonewall has been heavily criticised. You obviously, as the commission chair, worked incredibly closely with Stonewall. Do you think that the critics of Stonewall are right to say they have been a huge part of the problem? Because they appear to convince many companies, many public sector bodies that actually trans rights did somehow trump women's rights.
I don't really know what happened to Stonewall. I mean, they were an extraordinary organization when they were set up in the 1980s. They led a transformation in public sentiment and attitude, which I think is unparalleled. If you think about the speed with which the British public moved from being not just hostile, but, kind of sort of having ghastly attitudes towards people who are gay and lesbians, let's say in the late 70s to the 90s, the speed of transformation in public attitudes was extraordinary and much more far-reaching, for example, than we've had even today on race or sex. And I think at the center of that was an incredible campaigning by the leaders of Stonewall, Angela Mason, Simon Fanshawe, Michael Cashman, and so on. Something happened, I think, in the early part of this century in which you could probably say that there's an argument that says that Stonewall actually was so successful, it started looking around for things to do because it had actually achieved its aims, and it chose the wrong things. And it seems to me here they added the T to LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual. They added the transsexual and tried to apply the lessons that were related to the first three to the last. And now we can get into the detail of it, but I think the truth of the matter is they just went off on the wrong path. And on top of that, what they then did to everybody was to say, if you don't agree with our stand on trans, which is that there is no difference between a trans woman and a woman, then we are going to out you, to use his phrase advisedly, as a bigot and a transphobe. And I think the problem here is that people folded rather than saying, that's just not the case here, and I dare you to try to do that. People just folded, and they took instructions which were instructions based on what Stonewall wanted the law to be rather than what the law actually was. And I think there were some people within that activist group who believed that if you could get enough organizations to pretend the law was something it isn't, then actually in some sense by osmosis, you would eventually establish a new reality that Parliament would eventually have to follow. I think that was the strategy. Now, I can't tell you how many things are wrong about that, but the real problem, I come back to this, is not so much, I guess, that Stonewall was wrong, it was, but that everybody else who knew better simply gave in. And that is my big worry here, that on these issues, people who should know better, people who should be holding the line, and that includes government ministers, it includes the bosses of media organizations and so on, are basically opting for the quiet life, allowing people who really are bullying them to make their organizations do things that they shouldn't. And that's how we get into this situation.
Do you think that any businesses or public sector organizations that are still abiding by Stonewall policies on this issue should pull out of that scheme.
Well, I suspect their lawyers are going to be telling them this morning, we shouldn't be signed up to anything that is clearly unlawful. I don't know the details of the current Stonewall, I think it's the Diversity Champion scheme, but it requires you to do and say certain things that you shouldn't. I suspect that every organisation's lawyers this morning will be saying we need to take another look at this. I should say there's no secret about this, because I wrote about it in our paper, or my paper, Times, a couple of months ago. I was required to do one of these questionnaires that everybody these days has to do, which are compliance things that you need to you need to do the training, and one of them, the aspects of this training, was to do with equality and diversity. One of the things that you have to go through it, and you have to get the answer right, or you can't go forward in the training. One of them was to do with a conversation that was being held in an office, an imagined conversation, about somebody who wanted to be called by a name which is typically female rather than male. And the guidance in that particular piece of online training was just wrong. It was just unlawful. I knew that at the time. I ticked the box, but then I wrote to the chair of the company saying there is absolutely no possibility that I will ever comply with this piece of legislation. I've had to give the wrong answer because otherwise I couldn't complete the training. But you need to understand that I will never do this. Now, I think what's going to have to happen after yesterday is all of that kind of training, which is done by hundreds of thousands of people across this country, is going to have to be withdrawn and rewritten.
Sir Trevor Phillips, thank you very much indeed. I think we've confirmed that the lawyers benefit from this, don't they?
As well as women.
It's always as well as women and as well as trans people. The lawyers can be cashing in now. Sir Trevor, you enjoy the rest of your Easter weekend. Thank you very, very much for joining us on the Daily Tea.
Thank you, Kamal. Thank you, Camilla.
Well, what a sensible explanation of how we've got to where we've got to. As he said at the beginning, I am actually friends with Trevor. I used to work for him at the Commission before the Equality Act actually was put in place. And from within that organisation, before this happened, it was just a place which was just about, can we just try and stop discrimination? And if the law helps us do that, that's really great. And then, as Trevor was suggesting, after his time there, he left in 2012, I left a bit before that, the place became part of the battle. It infected so many different organisations, which I still, Camilla, find absolutely baffling. I thought one of the two big points he made were about the NHS should stop whining.
Yeah.
And also hundreds of thousands of people in the public and private sector are doing equality training that is now probably unlawful.
Well, it's always been unlawful.
Well, sorry, it's always been unlawful.
It's been unlawful.
And now we know it
And now we
more
know it.
clearly.
And also, I mean, I don't want to be crowing, but it's like there's been a lot of revisionism this morning, a lot of people pretending that they were on the right side of this argument. You know, Bridget Phillipson's come forward saying, yes, well, you know, I've always argued that women's spaces should be protected. There's always a tweet saying precisely the opposite in recent years. I tell you who has always been on the right side of this argument. The Telegraph. You know, we started out from this, looking at this going, no, I think this is a willful misinterpretation of the legislation and doesn't make any sense. And again, got vilified for it, but good to have some degree of vindication in the highest court of the land yesterday.
Well, as we said, this has been one of the most momentous 48 hours, not just on the issue of the rights of women and the rights of trans people, etc., but just in the debate we are having about what kind of country we want to be. I thought it was also nice that Trevor reminded us of, we went on a journey from the 1970s to the 1990s around sexual orientation, which was well handled because the public got it.
Yeah.
And it was very clear, and it was all just about fairness.
Also,
and then
people
somehow
weren't shouted down.
Yeah.
If somebody said, well, I think that gays should be able to marry, and somebody else said, I don't know if I agree because I'm a Christian or I've got reasons for believing what I believe. I don't remember people shouting at them going, you're a bigot, you need to be cancelled, why are you even in your job? And hounded out of institutions with people with balaclavas on. I don't think that did happen at the time.
I think there was some pretty hair-raising campaigning, but I think you're right that I
It
think
wasn't
maybe the
thought
internet,
policing.
yeah, and maybe with the internet and social media, we have the activists have different weapons. I think an important thing though is it is very British to get on with your neighbour.
Mm.
It's a British value, and we've spoken about what are British values on this podcast a few times, Camilla. And that's what I most love about this country is the fact that we want to be fair to everyone. We want to give everyone a fair opportunity, and we want to make sure that those actions don't affect others negatively. That's obviously the wrong thing. And hopefully with a bit of sense now, because people can finally understand what the law really does say, thanks to the Supreme Court, we can go back to being truly British about how we treat each other.
Amen to that.